This is the Commander's Beacon. I'm Eric. I'm here to talk about some unconventional ways to build commander decks. And today let's talk about Ruxa, Patient Professor. Ruxa is a 4/4 bear druid that costs 2 green. Ruxa also has a very frilly robe. I don't think that much frill is necessary. Also, Ruxa is a bear. Bears have fur. Fur is a good insulator. Bears are also big. Ruxa, for example, is a 4/4. That's a pretty big bear. And big animals typically retain their body heat better than smaller animals, since larger animals typically have a lower surface area to volume ratio. Body heat production would scale roughly with body volume, but heat loss to the environment would scale with body surface area. So larger animals, with lower relative surface areas, would survive well in colder environments, and would overheat faster in hot environments compared to smaller animals. Now, in addition, Ruxa also has this frilly robe with multiple layers, which is also probably very insulating. So all of this is to say that I think Ruxa would probably be overheating in this indoor classroom, or maybe the human students who are smaller and don't have fur are freezing to death if they keep it cold enough for Ruxa to be comfortable. So which is it? Is it too hot in there for Ruxa, or is it too cold for the humans? This inconsistency bothers me, and it's a major oversight in the artistic design of this card. Okay, I get it. You're telling me to chill out. This is Magic the Gathering. They can probably keep everyone in thermal equilibrium through magic, right? No, they can't. I mean, have you even played Magic in the last 25 plus years? If they wanted to use magic to heat up the students, they would need red spells. Last time I checked, red magic that heats things up also deals damage. Ruxa might survive a few points of damage, but most of her students would die. Well, maybe you say they're air conditioning Ruxa instead. No, they're not. Magic that cools things down is typically blue, and those blue spells typically tap creatures. Ruxa clearly does not enter the battlefield tapped or become tapped by anything it does naturally other than attacking. There is no practical HVAC building design that facilitates reasonable living temperatures for both Ruxa and her students in the same room, and this is a serious problem. But other than that, let's talk about what Ruxa actually does. When Ruxa, Patient Professor, enters the battlefield or attacks, return target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. Ruxa also gives all of your creatures with no abilities +1/+1, and you may have creatures you control with no abilities assign their combat damage as though they weren't blocked. Now Ruxa is clearly a commander for Vanilla Creature Tribal, which no one asked for, but now that it's here, it's okay. Now, Vanilla Creature Tribal is certainly unique, and there are at least 2 ways that a Ruxa deck is typically built. I'll try to add a third possibility here, but we'll get to that later. First, you can, quite obviously, build around vanilla creatures. There are 98 total vanilla creature cards within the green color identity. They range from 0 mana to 8 mana. They also have a decent mana curve. There are only 8 options for vanilla creatures that cost 0 or 1 mana, but there are 32 combined 2 and 3 drops. There's an unusual shortage of 4 drops, which is actually fine because the commander costs 4 mana. There's also a bunch of 5 drops, 24 to be exact, and declining numbers of vanilla creatures with mana values of 6, 7, and 8. So you do have options when building around vanilla creatures, at least as far as your mana curve and your power and toughness are concerned. Otherwise, of course, your creatures are vanilla and they will do absolutely nothing. There are a couple of notable creatures with good power and toughness for their mana value. Otherwise, all of these creatures will be very, very underwhelming. Of course, Ruxa will make your vanilla creatures somewhat unblockable. They still die to blockers, but they can at least do their damage to players, even if they're blocked. Note that if you choose to have your vanilla creature deal its damage as though it wasn't blocked, then it won't do its damage to the blocking creature. Ruxa is also a minor anthem for your vanilla creatures, and she can recur them from your graveyard, typically at a rate of 1 per turn if she can attack safely. So Ruxa provides a lot of benefits for our vanilla creatures. But does Ruxa make these vanilla creatures powerful and impactful despite their vanilla-ness when she's on the battlefield to boost them? Well, absolutely not. And that's why another popular way to play Ruxa is as the leader of a tokens deck, because most token creatures don't have abilities, so they are vanilla creatures. Now, if we play a tokens deck, we can take advantage of all the effective token synergies in green, like Doubling Season and Parallel Lives. Tokens won't be able to take advantage of Ruxa's Graveyard Recursion ability that she gets to use for vanilla creatures, but they do retain the +1/+1 Anthem, and more importantly, the ability to deal combat damage to players as though they weren't blocked. And another argument for tokens is that if you're playing with vanilla creature cards instead of tokens, then your deck will absolutely be terrible when Ruxa isn't on the battlefield. You will not win games with Colonian Tusker by itself. But a token deck, especially in green, can very well threaten a victory with or without Ruxa. The commander just makes it easier. But there is a problem with using Ruxa to command a token deck. It's just really boring, and there are so many better token commanders out there, even just within Commander 2021. So I still want to focus on vanilla creatures, as in vanilla creature cards rather than tokens, because it's unique, and because our commander can help recur them from the graveyard, so we can play around perhaps with a little bit of a sacrifice sub-theme. But I also don't want my deck to be terrible when Ruxa isn't on the battlefield. So I've decided to augment my vanilla creatures with equipment that give them abilities, without actually giving them abilities. Equipment that let me make my vanilla creatures stronger, or give them utility and other functionality, but they'll still retain that pseudo-unblockable that Ruxa provides. They still retain the Anthem, they can still be recurred from the graveyard. Now we have to be careful because there are plenty of equipment that we can't use. A Sword of Vengeance gives the equipped creature +2/+0, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. Now that power and toughness boost is fine, but those other things are abilities, so equipping the Sword of Vengeance to a creature instantly turns it into a creature with abilities, and so Ruxa will not affect it. Sorcerer's Wand lets a creature tap to deal 1 damage to a player or planeswalker. This is also an ability given to the creature, so a creature equipped with Sorcerer's Wand will not be affected by Ruxa. Basically, any effect that says a creature has something. That's the key word we want to pay attention to. Has. That equipment gives the creature an ability. But let's look at a counterexample. Adventuring Gear has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, the equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. This does not give the creature an ability, so a vanilla creature wearing Adventuring Gear will still have no abilities, even if we've played a land that turn. Now sadly, some of the best equipment in Magic are the swords, and all of these prevent the creature from being vanilla, because they all give the creature protection from some colors, which is an ability, so we won't be playing those swords here. So our goal for this deck is to find impactful equipment that we can use to buff up our vanilla creatures, and then take even further advantage of them with Ruxa to go for the win, probably through combat damage because we're in mono green. Let's start by talking about the equipment that we'll be playing. We're using 14 pieces of equipment in this deck. Our equipment will help us ramp, draw cards, and kill our opponents. We'll use Dousing Dagger, Goldvein Pick, and Sword of the Animist for ramp. Now when the creature equipped with Dousing Dagger deals combat damage to a player, it transforms into Lost Veil, which taps for 3 mana of any color. Now, the downside is we need to give an opponent 2 0/2 plant creature tokens to block with, so theoretically it's a little harder for us to get in for combat damage to transform the equipment. But remember, Ruxa lets our vanilla creatures deal combat damage as though they weren't blocked, so transforming Dousing Dagger is very easy in this deck. I wanted to bring this example up first because it's one we'll keep coming back to. Our commander makes it trivial to deal combat damage to players, so we'll get a lot of value from equipment that have triggered abilities based on dealing combat damage to a player. Speaking of which, let's bring up Goldvein Pick. This is another one. It gives us a treasure token whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. And of course we'll use Sword of the Animist. This is good ramp even if you're not playing an equipment deck, even if you're not dealing combat damage to a player, because the Sword of the Animist is triggering on attack. Now for card draw, we'll use Mask of Memory and Rogue's Gloves. Both of these let us draw cards when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player. With Mask of Memory, we'll draw 2 cards and discard 1. With Rogue's Gloves, we'll draw 1 card. Of course, we'll use Skull Clamp. Ruxa can recur our creatures easily, so we don't care too much if they die. especially when they're wearing the Skull Clamp. I don't need to say much else to defend Skull Clamp, I think. Of course, we'll use a few sacrifice outlets in this deck too, which I'll mention later. But let's talk about our equipment that help us win the game. A Bloodforged Battle Axe costs 1, equips for 2, and it gives the equipped creature +2/+0. And when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, I'm going to be saying that a lot today, we get to make a token copy of Bloodforged Battle Axe. Again, that's trivial in this deck, thanks to Ruxa. A Bloodforged Battle Axe will exponentially get out of control. Let's talk about Inquisitor's Flail. This causes the equipped creature to deal double the combat damage, but it's not double strike, so it's still a vanilla creature. It also causes the equipped creature to receive double the combat damage from other creatures, but we don't really care since Ruxa can help us recur our dead vanilla creatures from the graveyard. A Spectre's Shroud gives the equipped creature +1/+0, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card. So this probably isn't game-winning, but it's sure to be annoying. We've got Prowler's Helm. This costs 2, equips for 2, and the equipped creature can't be blocked, except by creatures with a defender. Now, this equipment is primarily in the deck to protect Ruxa, so she can attack without being blocked and killed, to help us get her attack trigger to recur our vanilla creatures from the graveyard. Of course, if Ruxa isn't on the battlefield, Prowler's Helm will still help any of our other creatures, like one that's wearing a Bloodforged Battle Axe or a Rogue's Gloves, to get in for combat damage when we need it. But one of our most powerful equipment is Umezawa's Jite. This used to be a really popular equipment. I think generally now it's powered out by a lot of the swords, but our deck can still take advantage of it. Umezawa's Jite costs 2 and equips for 2. Whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to anything, a creature or player, planeswalker, whatever, the Jite gets 2 charge counters. And you can remove a charge counter to activate one of 3 modes. First, you can give the equipped creature +2/+2 until end of turn, or target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, or you gain 2 life. Once you've attacked a couple of times and you get 3 or 4 or more charge counters on this, it'll be pretty hard for your opponents to deal with it, and as a result it'll be hard for them to prevent you from getting even more charge counters. And what's really cool is that those last 2 modes, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and you gain 2 life, these can be activated even when the Jite isn't equipped onto a creature. Now I've also included Spellbinder. This is a somewhat clunky equipment that sounds pretty cool in theory, but it's just really hard to get much value out of it. Spellbinder costs 3 and it equips for 4, so that's a lot, and it has Imprint. When you cast it, you exile an instant card from your hand. When the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you can copy the imprinted card and cast that copy without paying its mana cost. So there's a lot you need to do to make this work. First, you need to pay 7 mana, 3 to cast it and 4 to equip it. You need to have a useful instant in your hand, and then you need to risk exiling it, because if an opponent destroys your Spellseeker, you won't get that instant back. Then you need to deal combat damage to a player, and after all that, your reward is you just get to cast your instant, which you could have done anyways with much less trouble. So how many times do you need to get in for combat damage to cast that instant for it to be worth it? Well, it depends. But I mean, it at least has to happen twice. If it's just once, then you could have cast that instant anyway for far less mana, probably, and less trouble. So while I don't think that Spellbinder is a good card, Ruxa is a pretty decent commander for it. Now we're in mono green, so we don't typically have the best instants, but we can get in for combat damage to trigger the Spellbinder pretty easily. And I've chosen to include as many instants as I could, first because that's just good deck design for contemporary commander, and secondly because we want to have Spellbinder targets. So there are 11 instants in this deck that we can imprint onto Spellbinder, and there's a reasonable spread of utility among them. Return of the Wildspeaker can help us draw cards. Note that the +3/+3 effect to all of our non-human creatures won't help, because we can only trigger it after we deal combat damage to a player, and by then it'll be too late for Return of the Wildspeaker's +3/+3 buff to affect that combat damage. We also have Inscription of Abundance, which is a nice modal spell that lets us gain life, put +1/+1 counters on a creature, or fight a creature, or we can pay the kicker cost to do all 3, and we can still do that even if we're casting a copy of the spell from Spellbinder. And then we've got some removal that we can imprint, like Beast Within, Ram Through, Nature's Claim. So we do have targets for Spellbinder, and I think it's a fun card to use, but again, it's also a fairly clunky card, and if you don't like it, you can certainly swap it out for something else. Now we'll also play Death Render. This equipment costs 4, it equips for 2, and it gives the equipped creature +2/+2. Death Render also has, when the equipped creature dies, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and attach Death Render to it. So this helps us with our recursion, and it works quite nicely with Ruxa. Ruxa can attack to recur a vanilla creature from your graveyard to your hand, and if you're also attacking with a vanilla creature that's wearing the Death Render, and if that creature is killed in combat, you can just put the creature that Ruxa recurred from your graveyard right onto the battlefield and equip Death Render to it. And again, we've also got a few sacrifice outlets that let us kill off our own creatures on demand, and I'll mention those later. Finally, we need to play Scythemaw. This costs 5, it equips for 3, and it gives the equipped creature +1/+1. It also has Living Weapon. When Scythemaw enters the battlefield, you create a 0/0 Germ creature token and equip Scythemaw to it. So it comes already equipped, but as soon as you unequip it, that Germ token dies, since it's a 0/0. Scythemaw also has, whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life, rounded up. So again, Ruxa gives our creatures pseudo-unblockable, so Scythemaw is great here. And that Germ token is also a creature with no abilities, so Ruxa can help that token get in for combat damage too. And actually, I guess with that in mind, that Germ token actually wouldn't die when you unequip the Scythemaw if Ruxa's on the field, because Ruxa would give it +1/+1. Probably doesn't matter too much, but I wanted to point it out. So those are our equipment, and to be honest, the bulk of the strategy of this deck is in the equipment. But we still have a few other tricks to go over. First, let's talk about the creatures. We're playing 22 creatures in this deck, not counting the commander. That number may seem a bit low, but first, this is an equipment deck, so we'll generally have fewer creatures to make space for those equipment. And secondly, our commander does help us with creature recursion. Now, of those 22 creatures, 17 of them have no abilities. Let's mention the creatures that do have abilities first. Towski, Bearer of Secrets, is a 4-mana 1/1 indestructible squirrel with a prosthetic that makes it kind of look like a squirrel pirate. Anyways, Towski makes you draw a card whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player. Again, dealing combat damage to players is trivial when Ruxa is on the field, so adding Towski here makes sense. We're also playing 3 creatures that have abilities to make vanilla creature tokens. Avenger of Zendikar doesn't need much explanation here, it's just a good card, and it's even better when the plant tokens that it creates are pseudo-unblockable. We'll also play Rampaging Baloths. We don't have any landfall synergies in this deck, this is not a lands matter deck, but Rampaging Baloths still creates enough value for it to be worth it. Finally, Wolverine Riders is one of a few creatures available in mono green that creates a creature token for us on each upkeep. That includes our opponent's upkeeps. That token in this case is a 1/1 green elf warrior. And Wolverine Riders also has, whenever another elf enters the battlefield under your control, you gain life equal to its toughness. Now I chose Wolverine Riders because the incremental life gain will help keep us alive, and with Ruxa on the field, those tokens will be 2/2s, so we'll actually gain 8 life each round of the table. I generally like to have a little bit of life gain in most of my commander decks when possible, though I try not to play bad cards just to get it. That said, if you wanted a more aggressive version of Wolverine Riders, you could swap it for Tendershoot Dryad, which costs 1 less mana and essentially makes 3/3s instead of 1/1s, once you have the City's Blessing anyways, but you won't get the life gain. So like I said, every other creature in the deck is vanilla, they have no abilities. But I've chosen to include all of the adventure creatures that I could, even the bad ones, because a creature with adventure is still a creature, and if it's a vanilla creature, it receives all of Ruxa's bonuses. That means it's pseudo-unblockable, it gets +1/+1, and even better, Ruxa can recur it from the graveyard. That means I can cast the spell side of Curious Pair to make a food token, then I can cast Curious Pair as a creature. Then if that creature dies, Ruxa can return it from my graveyard to my hand, and I can cast the adventure side again to get another food token, and I can repeat this indefinitely. Now, do we have any synergy with food tokens in this deck? We absolutely do not, but this is a Vanilla Matters deck. Curious Pair is competing with Grizzly Bears, so we'll take the food token. Like I said, we'll also play every single one of those bad vanilla mono green adventure creatures. There's only 2 more of them, and I can't say anything nice about them, so I won't say anything at all. But they're up there on the screen if you want to take a look. Don't say I didn't warn you. Lastly, we'll run Sandworm Convergence. This isn't a creature, but basically it is one in practice. It's an 8-mana enchantment that makes a 5/5 worm token for you at the end of each of your turns. It also says creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. That's important since we're playing vanilla creatures, so we won't be able to block flyers pretty much ever. Now, as far as vanilla creatures go, I've tried to select the best rates for power and toughness that I could get at each mana value, and I generally preferred higher power over high toughness since we want to get in for combat damage to win, and we need high power creatures to do that. I'm not going to list those creatures here because they're all very, very boring, and I'm not going to make you listen to that. But as always, you can see the description for a link to the full deck list. Those are the creatures that we'll be using in this Ruxa deck. Let's talk about a few more of the synergy pieces that we have access to. Since Ruxa can recur vanilla creatures from our graveyard, we may want to be able to sacrifice our own creatures for value, then get them back to do it again. We've already mentioned Skullclamp and Death Render, which gives us some value from our creatures' deaths. We'll also use Evolutionary Leap. This is a 2-mana enchantment that lets you pay green and sacrifice a creature to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, and you put that card into your hand. So there's a lot of potential uses for Evolutionary Leap. First, you can sacrifice a creature that's wearing a Skullclamp to draw 2 cards. Remember, Ruxa gives all your vanilla creatures +1/+1, so none of your creatures will automatically die when they equip the Skullclamp to give you that card draw. So you'll need a sacrifice outlet if you want to draw those cards right now. You can also use Evolutionary Leap to essentially trade a small creature on the battlefield for a chance at getting a big one out of your deck. If you don't have a creature in your graveyard and Ruxa has an open attack, you could sacrifice a creature to Evolutionary Leap before combat, then attack with Ruxa to get that creature back. You could sacrifice all of your creatures to Evolutionary Leap in response to a board wipe, so you get that many creatures back to your hand, out of your deck, so this card is pretty great here. We'll also use Greater Good. This is an enchantment that costs 2 green. It lets you sacrifice a creature to draw cards equal to that creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So as long as you can sacrifice a creature with power 4 or greater, you'll get a net gain of at least 1 card in hand when you do this. Between our commander giving our vanilla creatures a small buff, and all of our equipment and other permanents buffing our creatures, it'll be fairly easy for most of our creatures in this deck to have a power of 4 or greater most of the time. Finally, we're using Momentous Fall. This is an instant that costs 2 green. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, and then you draw cards equal to that creature's power and gain life equal to its toughness. Momentous Fall is really popular in decks with very high power creatures, and now we're not going to be drawing 20 cards from Momentous Fall in this deck, unless we've been maybe really successful with our Bloodforged Battle Axe. Still, we can recur our dead creatures, and we can sometimes gain value by sacrificing our creatures. We also have a reasonable number of ways to pump up our creatures to 4 or 5 or 7 or more power, so we should at least get a decent return from Momentous Fall. Now we need to mention a couple of cards that are obvious includes in a Ruxa deck. I'm not going to spend too much time on these. They already have high inclusion rates in Ruxa decks on EDHREC, and they don't really need much extra justification. First, there's Dolmen Gate. This is a 2-mana artifact that says, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures you control. This basically converts Ruxa's pseudo-unblockability for our vanilla creatures to true unblockability. With Ruxa and Dolmen Gate on the field together, our vanilla creatures can still be blocked, but they can deal damage as though they weren't blocked, and they won't take damage from the blocking creatures, so they won't die to combat damage. This is essentially unblockability. I don't really think Dolmen Gate needs any further justification. It works really well here. I'll just very briefly mention Miraganda Petroglyphs. It's a 4-mana enchantment that gives all creatures you control with no abilities +2/+2, and that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm also playing Torpor Orb. This is our single hate card in the deck. It's a 2-mana artifact that says creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. Commander is full of powerful ETB effects on creatures, except of course when your deck is filled with mostly vanilla creatures. Now be aware that Torpor Orb can still affect us a little bit. Our commander has an enters the battlefield effect, though that effect can also be triggered by attacking. And we also have Avenger of Zendikar in our deck, which has a very powerful enters the battlefield effect. But overall, Torpor Orb will definitely hurt our opponents much more than it hurts us. Now I want to mention a couple of our removal spells, starting with another obvious include. It's Izuri's Predation. This is an 8-mana sorcery. For each creature your opponents control, you create a 4/4 green beast creature token. Each of those beasts fights a different one of those creatures. Again, this is an obvious include in a Ruxa deck. First, we're in green, so creature board wipes are a rarity. Secondly, those 4/4s that we create will actually be 5/5s when Ruxa's in play, so we essentially destroy all of our opponent's creatures that have 5 or less toughness. Then if we have any surviving beasts on our next turn, Ruxa will give them pseudo-unblockability. Again, I don't need to defend this card, it's already being played in 50% of Ruxa decks, and for good reason. I also want to mention Broken Wings. This is a 3-mana instant that destroys target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. So as I've mentioned before, we absolutely cannot block flyers. Outside of killing them with fight effects, we have no choice but to just sit there and take it. I included Broken Wings because it's versatile. There won't always be a flyer that we need to kill, so I didn't want to run dedicated removal for flyers like Plummet, even if it's a bit more mana efficient. At least Broken Wings can hit artifacts or enchantments when we need it to. And I want to mention one more ramp piece, that's Heraldic Banner. This is an artifact that costs 3 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. Heraldic Banner taps for 1 mana of that color, and all creatures you control of that color get +1/+0. Now, in conventional Commander, 3 mana rocks that tap for 1 are frowned upon, but this is a monocolor deck. We don't care about the color of mana that Heraldic Banner produces. And we're a creature-focused deck, and every single one of those creatures and creature tokens in this deck is green. And we're using those creatures mostly for combat, so Heraldic Banner actually works great here. It's a mana rock and an anthem. And I defend the use of Heraldic Banner in pretty much any creature-centric monocolored deck. Lastly, I want to mention a single one of our lands. Inventor's Fair taps for colorless. You can also pay 4 and tap and sacrifice it to search your library for an artifact and put it into your hand. You can only activate this ability if you control 3 or more artifacts. We have 19 artifacts in this deck, so we shouldn't have any trouble activating Inventor's Fair most of the time. This is our mono-green equipment tutor. But outside of powerful equipment, we can also use Inventor's Fair to get some of our other powerful artifacts if we need to, like Dolmen Gate or Torpor Orb. So that's most of the deck. And again, I'm not covering a lot of the card draw, ramp, or removal that are fairly basic things that aren't really synergistic with the deck. But again, you can see a link to the full deck list in the description if you want more detail. For now, let's break down the deck stats and cost. This equipment-focused Ruxa Patient Professor deck has an average CMC of 3.05. We have 35 lands. Technically there are 36, but I don't count Maze of Ith since it doesn't produce mana. This deck has 22 creatures, not counting the commander, and 17 of those creatures are vanilla, or they have no abilities. We have 19 artifacts, and of those, 14 are equipment that help us draw cards, ramp, or just defeat our opponents in combat. We have 9 card draw cards and 8 pieces of ramp. And this deck has 9 pieces of single target removal and 2 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck's value is $190.02. I'm not going to provide a budget deck list since this deck strategy is highly dependent on specific equipment, and some of those equipment are expensive and don't really have good budget alternatives. But I will at least mention a few cards that you could swap out to bring down the cost of the deck. A Bloodforged Battle Axe is $21, and there simply isn't another piece of equipment that provides the same sort of game-ending combat damage inevitability that we can get through Bloodforged Battle Axe, at least when we're restricted to equipment that don't give abilities to creatures. There's also Umezawa's Jite, which is currently $27. The utility provided by this equipment is amazing. Our equipped creature can get really big, or we can use it to remove our opponent's creatures, or if our life total is low, we can just gain life. Now, if you really wanted to swap out one of these equipment for something easier on the budget, I would recommend Argentum Armor. Yes, it's a bunch of mana, it's 6 to cast and 6 to equip, but our equipped creature will get big and it'll help us with removal too. The equipped creature gets +6/+6, and when it attacks, you get to destroy target permanent. For some big dumb value, you could also consider Strata Scythe. This costs 3, equips for 3, and it has imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a land and exile it, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land on the battlefield with the same name as the exiled card. Of course, we're a mono-green deck, so we'll pick a forest, and this deck has 22 forests. Don't forget your opponent's basic forests will count towards Strata Scythe's ability too. We're also using Skull Clamp, which is $9. This card is amazing, and there is no effective substitute. I would highly recommend keeping Skull Clamp in the deck if possible, but if you absolutely need to cut costs, you could try Infiltration Lens. This costs 1, equips for 1, and then if the equipped creature becomes blocked, you draw 2 cards. Note, of course, that you can still choose to deal damage to your opponent as if your creature wasn't blocked, that is if Ruxa is in play and the equipped creature has no abilities, and you'll still draw the cards from Infiltration Lens if you were blocked. The other expensive artifacts in the deck include Dolmen Gate at $6 and Torpor Orb at $9. Dolmen Gate is really effective in this deck. There's really nothing that can replace it functionally. Torpor Orb, however, is just nice to have. It slows your opponents down, but otherwise it doesn't really help you win. But it also doesn't really have any functional replacements either. If you really need to remove either of these cards, I would recommend just adding more creatures to the deck to replace them, since I've noticed in playtesting the deck can sometimes run low on creatures, even with Ruxa's recursion. The deck also has a couple of high-value lands in Maze of Ith and Inventor's Fair. Maze of Ith is just here to provide some defensive value, since we want to be attacking with our creatures rather than leaving them up for defense, and some creatures, again like flyers, we simply can't block at all. But the necessity of having these types of creature defenses like Maze of Ith, it's going to be absolutely meta-dependent, and if you're on a budget, you could swap Maze of Ith for one of the much less effective versions, like Mystifying Maze. Mystifying Maze essentially costs 5 mana to do what Maze of Ith does for free, but at least you can tap Mystifying Maze for mana if you need to. Inventor's Fair is a really useful artifact and equipment tutor, but perhaps the next best thing is to tutor artifacts out of your graveyard instead of your library. This deck is already running Buried Ruin for just that reason, but you could also run Sequestered Stash, which also helps you recover artifacts from your graveyard. Now there's one more budget cut I want to mention, and this is an easy one. Trained Jackal is a 1-mana 1/2, but it was only printed once in Portal 3 Kingdoms, so it's $8. Now I've chosen to run all 3 of the available 1-mana 1/2s in this deck, but if you don't think it's practical to pay $8 for a vanilla 1/2 creature, and it's not, then you could easily swap your Trained Jackal for something like Willow Elf, which is only a 1/1, but it's also less than $1. So that's Ruxa, Patient Professor. Again, with this build I really wanted to use vanilla creature cards to take advantage of Ruxa's Graveyard Recursion ability, which you can't really use if you're building a token deck centered around Ruxa. But we're also using a lot of equipment to power up our vanilla creatures and give them extra abilities and utility without turning off Ruxa's buffs. And while these equipment work really well when we can equip them onto vanilla creatures while Ruxa's on the field, they can also help give us some staying power even if our opponents keep Ruxa off the field. Because again, if you play a deck with a bunch of vanilla creatures and your opponents keep Ruxa off the battlefield, you're not going to have a very good time, unless you've got something like these equipment to power up your creatures a bit. But anyways, that's all I've got for today. Come back next time. I've got plans for at least 1 or 2 more Strixhaven and C21 deck techs. And thank you for watching.